Before we begin this incredible true story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another amazing story like this. 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Palace as James Mitchell stood at attention. His red uniform was immaculate, each button polished to perfection, his tall bearskin hat sitting proudly on his head. For 5 years, James had served as a royal guard, a position that required unwavering discipline, silence, and ability to remain motionless for hours regardless of weather or distraction. To the thousands of tourists who photographed him daily, he was simply a living statue, a ceremonial figure frozen in time. What they did not know was that behind those steady eyes and stoic expression lived a mind that consumed a knowledge like wildfire consumes dry grass. James had not always dreamed of being a guard. As a boy growing up in a small village in Yorkshire, he had spent countless hours in the local library reading everything he could find. His family had little money, and university seemed like a distant dream reserved for others. When he turned 18, military service offered a path forward. He took it without hesitation. The discipline of military life suited James perfectly. While his fellow recruits complained about the rigid schedules and demanding training, he thrived. More importantly, the structure gave him something he had always craved: time. During his off-duty hours, while others went to pubs or watched television, James read. He read history, philosophy, science, literature, and anything else he could access. His small quarters became filled with books borrowed from libraries, purchased from charity shops, or downloaded onto a well-worn tablet. When he was selected for the prestigious position of Royal Guard, his mother had cried with pride. The job came with respect, decent pay, and the honor of protecting one of the world's most famous families. James accepted the role gratefully, knowing that the long hours of stillness would give his mind freedom to wander through the corridors of knowledge he had built over the years. On this particular Tuesday morning, James had no idea that his life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. As he took his position outside the palace gates, the usual crowd began to gather. Tourists snapped photos, children waved, and occasionally someone would try to make him laugh or break his composure. James had mastered the art of remaining unmoved. His mind, however, was elsewhere. Mentally reviewing a documentary about ancient Rome he had watched the previous evening across the city. In a prestigious private school in Kensington, Thomas Whitmore was preparing for his day with considerably less enthusiasm. At 52 years old, Thomas had taught history for nearly 3 decades. He held a doctorate from Oxford, had published 2 books on medieval European history, and was widely regarded as one of the finest educators in London. His students respected him. His colleagues admired him. Parents paid substantial fees, partly because teachers like Thomas were on staff. Yet lately, Thomas had been feeling restless. Teaching the same curriculum year after year had become predictable. He could deliver his lectures about the Tudor dynasty or the French Revolution in his sleep. The spark that had once driven his passion for history felt dimmed, replaced by comfortable routine. His wife had noticed his discontent and suggested he needed a new challenge, something to reignite his intellectual fire. That morning, as Thomas drove to school, he heard an advertisement on the radio that caught his attention. A popular television program called Battle of Minds was holding open auditions in London. The show pitted contestants against each other in various knowledge competitions, covering topics from science to arts to history. The format was simple, but engaging. 2 contestants would face increasingly difficult questions until one emerged victorious. The winner would receive a cash prize and, more importantly, the satisfaction of proving their intellectual prowess on national television. Thomas found himself intrigued. He had never considered appearing on television, viewing such programs as entertainment rather than serious intellectual pursuits, but something about the advertisement appealed to him. Perhaps it was the chance to test himself outside the familiar confines of his classroom. Perhaps it was the opportunity to demonstrate that academic knowledge had real value beyond exam papers and textbooks. Whatever the reason, he made a mental note of the audition details. During his lunch break, Thomas mentioned the program to his colleague, Margaret, who taught English literature. She immediately encouraged him to audition. "You would be brilliant, Thomas. You know everything about history. When was the last time you did something unexpected?" Her words resonated more than she probably realized. That evening, instead of grading papers, Thomas filled out the online application for Battle of Minds. Meanwhile, James finished his 8-hour shift at the palace and returned to his modest apartment in South London. After changing out of his uniform and preparing a simple dinner, he settled into his favorite chair with a book about quantum physics. He had developed an interest in science over the past year, finding fascinating connections between historical patterns and scientific principles. As he read, his phone buzzed with a message from his sister, Sarah. Sarah had always been James's biggest supporter. Despite the 11-year age gap between them, they shared a close bond. She knew about his voracious appetite for learning and often sent him interesting articles or documentary recommendations. Tonight's message was different. She had seen the advertisement for Battle of Minds and immediately thought of her brother. "You should audition. You know more than anyone I have ever met. Imagine showing everyone what is really inside that Royal Guard uniform." James smiled at her enthusiasm, but felt doubtful. He was a private person, uncomfortable with attention or spotlight. The idea of appearing on television felt completely foreign to his nature. Yet as he considered Sarah's suggestion, a small seed of curiosity began to grow. What would it be like to test his knowledge against others? For years his learning had been solitary and personal. The competition might offer something he had never experienced: validation, before he could talk himself out of it. James opened his laptop and navigated to the show's website. The application asked basic questions about background, education, and areas of expertise. In the section asking why he wanted to participate, James paused. Finally, he typed, "I want to prove that knowledge has no boundaries and that learning is available to anyone willing to pursue it, regardless of their formal education." He hit submit before doubt could change his mind. 3 weeks passed before James received an email from the Battle of Minds production team. He was sitting in the palace guard room during a break when his phone notification chimed. The message informed him that he had been selected for an in-person audition. His heart raced as he read the details. The audition would involve a written test, followed by a brief interview with the producers. They wanted to assess not just his knowledge, but also his ability to perform under pressure and engage with an audience. James immediately called Sarah, who screamed with excitement so loudly he had to pull the phone away from his ear. She insisted on helping him prepare, though James assured her he had been preparing his entire life without knowing it. Still, Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious, and her confidence in him bolstered his own wavering courage. Thomas Whitmore had received a similar email and had a very different reaction. He felt a calm satisfaction. Viewing the audition invitation as confirmation of what he already knew, his knowledge was exceptional. Unlike James, who spent the following weeks experiencing waves of nervousness and doubt, Thomas approached the audition with the same measured confidence he brought to his classroom. He reviewed some of his favorite historical topics, but mostly continued his normal routine. The audition day arrived on a rainy Saturday morning in late March. The production studio was located in a nondescript building in East London. James arrived early, wearing casual civilian clothes that felt strange after spending so much time in uniform. The waiting room was filled with about 30 other candidates, each clutching folders or notebooks, some quietly reviewing notes, others chatting nervously with fellow applicants. James sat in a corner, observing the diverse group. There was a young woman who introduced herself as a medical student, an older gentleman who worked as a librarian, a software engineer, and various others from different backgrounds. The atmosphere buzzed with competitive energy mixed with anxiety. James wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. These people seemed so confident, so certain of their abilities. Thomas arrived precisely on time, neither early nor late. He immediately noticed the nervous energy in the room and felt somewhat detached from it. He had spent decades in front of audiences, dealing with the pressure of educating young minds and facing scrutinizing parents. This audition, he reasoned, was simply another performance, albeit with different stakes. The written test began at 10 o'clock sharp. Candidates were given 90 minutes to answer 100 100 multiple-choice questions covering an extraordinarily wide range of topics. The questions jumped from ancient civilizations to modern technology, from classical music to contemporary politics. From mathematical concepts to literary analysis, the breadth was intentionally overwhelming, designed to identify candidates with genuinely diverse knowledge rather than narrow expertise. James felt his military training kick in as he began the test. He had learned to remain calm under pressure, to focus on one task at a time without being overwhelmed by the larger picture. He moved through the questions methodically, marking answers he was certain about and flagging those requiring more thought. Some questions were straightforward. Others required him to draw connections between different areas of knowledge, exactly the kind of thinking his years of independent study had cultivated. Thomas approached the test with academic precision. He excelled in questions about history, politics, and literature as expected. However, he found himself stumbling on questions about popular culture, modern technology, and certain scientific concepts outside his usual reading. He felt a flicker of frustration. His doctorate suddenly seemed less impressive when faced with questions about which programming language was used for a particular application or which artist had recently won a specific music award. When the 90 minutes ended, candidates submitted their tests and were told to wait. The producers would score them immediately and call selected individuals for interviews. The waiting period felt endless. James tried to read on his phone but could not concentrate. Thomas chatted briefly with the librarian about a question regarding Renaissance art, both agreeing the answer options had been deliberately tricky. After 45 minutes, a producer emerged with a clipboard. She called 10 names. James held his breath. "James Mitchell," she announced. Relief and terror struck him simultaneously. He stood on shaking legs and followed the group into another room. Thomas's name was also called, and he walked with measured confidence, nodding politely to the other selected candidates. The interview room was small and intimate, with 3 producers sitting behind a table. One by one, candidates were called in individually. When James's turn came, he sat down facing 3 friendly but assessing faces. They asked him about his background, his work as a royal guard, and what had motivated him to apply. James spoke honestly about his love of learning, his belief that education should not be limited by circumstance, and his desire to show that knowledge could be found in unexpected places. "Tell us something fascinating you have learned recently," one producer requested. James thought for a moment, then began describing a connection he had discovered between Roman military tactics and modern crowd control psychology. His voice grew animated as he explained the parallels, his initial nervousness dissolving into genuine enthusiasm. The producers exchanged glances and made notes. Thomas's interview followed a similar pattern, though his responses carried the polish of someone comfortable with public speaking. He discussed his teaching career, his publications, and his expertise in medieval history. When asked about recent learning, he described a debate about historical revisionism he had followed in academic journals. His answers were articulate and impressive, delivered with the authority of decades of scholarship as candidates finished their interviews. They were thanked and told that selected contestants would be contacted within 1 week. James left the building feeling emotionally drained, but oddly exhilarated. He had no idea how he had performed, but the experience itself had been valuable. For once, he had stepped outside his comfort zone and challenged himself in a completely new way. Thomas departed feeling cautiously optimistic. The interview had gone well, he thought, though the written test had contained more surprises than he had anticipated. Perhaps that restlessness he had been feeling was justified. Perhaps he had become too comfortable in his narrow academic specialty, losing touch with the broader world of knowledge he had once found so exciting. 5 days later, both men received phone calls that would change their lives. James was at work, standing guard, when his phone vibrated in his pocket. During his break, he listened to the voicemail 3 times to make sure he had heard correctly. He had been selected as a contestant on Battle of Minds. The first episode would be filmed in 2 weeks. Sarah cried when he told her. Thomas received his call during his planning period at school. He answered immediately, and the producer congratulated him on his selection. Thomas felt a surge of validation, Of course, he had been chosen. His credentials spoke for themselves. Yet beneath the confidence, a small voice whispered a warning. The test had been harder than expected. Maybe this competition would require more than his academic pedigree. Neither James nor Thomas knew yet that they would face each other. The producers had deliberately matched them, intrigued by the contrast between the formally educated history teacher and the self-taught royal guard. They sensed that this particular pairing could create compelling television, perhaps even something more meaningful. They had no idea just how right they were. The 2 weeks before filming passed in a blur for James. The production team had sent detailed information about the show's format. Each episode would feature 2 contestants facing off in 3 rounds of questions. The first round covered general knowledge across all subjects. The second round allowed each contestant to choose their specialist subject. The final round returned to general knowledge, but with significantly harder questions. If both contestants remained tied after 3 rounds, a sudden death round would determine the winner. James requested time off from his duties at the palace, explaining the situation to his commanding officer. The man had seemed surprised but supportive, joking that James would bring honor to the guards if he performed well. His fellow guards reacted with a mixture of amusement and genuine encouragement. Most had no idea about James's intellectual pursuits. To them, he was simply a reliable colleague who kept to himself during breaks. Sarah insisted on helping James prepare, though her help mostly consisted of moral support and enthusiasm. She quizzed him using trivia apps and watched old episodes of Battle of Minds with him. Analyzing the types of questions asked and the strategies successful contestants employed, James appreciated her efforts, but found himself relying more on his usual routine, reading, watching documentaries, and absorbing information across as many subjects as possible. The night before filming, James barely slept. He lay awake, wondering who his opponent would be, what questions would be asked, whether he would freeze under the studio lights. His entire life had been lived in relative anonymity. Even as a royal guard, he was anonymous, his individual identity hidden beneath the uniform and the role. Tomorrow, he would step into a spotlight with his own name, his own face, his own voice. The vulnerability of it terrified him. Thomas, by contrast, had prepared with his characteristic methodical approach. He reviewed key dates, important figures, and major events across various historical periods. He also made an effort to brush up on contemporary topics. Recognizing that his weak performance on modern questions during the audition could be a liability, he read technology blogs, scanned entertainment news, and even asked his teenage daughter to explain current social media trends to him. His wife noticed his unusual intensity and teased him gently about finally finding something that made him nervous. Thomas laughed it off, but she was right. Beneath his confident exterior, he felt the pressure of his reputation. His colleagues knew about his participation, his students had been told, and several friends had promised to watch. He was not just representing himself, but also his years of academic achievement. Losing to someone less educated would be humiliating. The filming took place in a studio in central London. James arrived early, his stomach churning with nerves. A production assistant greeted him warmly and led him to a dressing room where makeup artists prepared him for the cameras. The bright lights and attention felt surreal. Another assistant went over the rules one final time and encouraged him to relax and be himself. In another dressing room, Thomas was undergoing similar preparations. He chatted easily with the staff, his natural confidence evident. When a producer mentioned that his opponent was a royal guard, Thomas felt a moment of surprise followed by reassurance. A guard would likely have military training, but not necessarily the breadth of education required for this competition. Thomas felt his chances were good. James learned about his opponent's identity at the same time. A history teacher with a doctorate from Oxford. His heart sank. How could he possibly compete with someone who had dedicated their entire career to academic study? He thought about withdrawing, claiming illness, simply disappearing before the humiliation could begin. Then he remembered why he had applied in the first place, to prove that knowledge was accessible to anyone willing to pursue it. If he quit now, he would be betraying that principle. The studio audience filed in. about 200 people filling the seats arranged around the central stage. Two podiums faced each other, separated by enough distance to prevent any collaboration, but close enough for the cameras to capture both contestants in the same shot. The host, a charismatic woman named Victoria Reynolds, was known for her quick wit and ability to make contestants feel at ease while maintaining the show's competitive tension. James and Thomas were brought to the stage during a commercial break before their segment. They shook hands, offering each other polite good wishes. James noticed Thomas's firm, confident grip and professional demeanor. Thomas noticed James's obvious nervousness, but also something else in his eyes: fierce determination. Victoria introduced them to the audience and television viewers at home. Tonight, we have a fascinating matchup. Thomas Whitmore is a history teacher and published author with a doctorate from Oxford University. James Mitchell serves as a royal guard at Windsor Palace. Gentlemen, are you ready? Both nodded, though James's nod was considerably less certain than Thomas's. The first round began. Victoria read the questions in her clear, engaging voice, alternating between contestants. James, which planet in our solar system has the most moons? James answered correctly: Saturn. Thomas, who wrote the novel 100 Years of Solitude? Thomas responded smoothly: Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The questions continued, covering literature, science, geography, popular culture, and sports. James found his rhythm after the first few questions. His nerves did not disappear, but he managed to push them aside, focusing entirely on each question as it came. His years of varied reading served him well. When asked about a specific Renaissance painting, he knew it. When questioned about a recent scientific discovery, he had read about it. When given a question about classical music, he recalled a documentary he had watched months earlier. Thomas performed strongly, his deep knowledge base evident. However, as the round progressed, he made small mistakes on questions outside his comfort zone. A question about computer programming languages tripped him up. Another about a contemporary pop artist caught him off guard. Each mistake was minor, but they accumulated by the end of the first round. James had answered 14 questions correctly out of 15. Thomas had answered 12 correctly out of 15. The audience, which had initially seemed sympathetic to the underdog royal guard, now watched with genuine interest. This was not going to be the straightforward victory many had expected. The second round brought a new challenge: specialist subjects. Thomas chose medieval European history, his area of expertise. He smiled confidently, knowing that few people could match his knowledge in this area. James hesitated, then chose military history and strategy. It was not his strongest subject, but his military service combined with his reading had given him substantial knowledge. Thomas went first. Victoria fired questions at him about the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, feudal systems, and medieval monarchs. Thomas answered with authority, providing not just correct answers but additional context that demonstrated his deep understanding. He scored perfectly, answering all 10 specialist questions correctly. The audience applauded, and Thomas allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He had just demonstrated exactly why decades of academic study mattered. Now it was James's turn. The questions began. James, what military strategy did Hannibal employ when crossing the Alps? James answered, using elephants and surprising the Romans by approaching from an unexpected direction. Which ancient Chinese military treatise has influenced strategy for over 2,000 years? James responded, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Question after question came, and James answered each one correctly. His voice grew steadier, his responses more confident. By the 8th question, Thomas's smile had faded. By the 10th question, which James answered correctly to match Thomas's perfect score, the audience erupted in applause. The Royal Guard, the man with no formal higher education, had just matched the Oxford-educated scholar in a knowledge competition. More incredibly, he had done so in a round that tested specialized expertise. Victoria announced the scores as they headed into the final round. We are tied at 24 points each, ladies and gentlemen. The final round will determine our winner tonight. The tension in the studio was palpable. What had seemed like a potential mismatch had become one of the most competitive. episodes in the show's history. During the brief break before the final round, James felt something shift inside himself. The crippling nervousness had transformed into focused intensity. He was not just participating anymore. He was competing, truly competing. Across from him, Thomas experienced his own realization. This royal guard was not simply lucky or well-prepared. He was genuinely knowledgeable, perhaps even more broadly knowledgeable than Thomas himself. For the first time in years, Thomas felt intellectually challenged in a way his classroom never provided. The final round began with a new intensity. Victoria explained that these questions would be significantly more difficult, drawing from obscure facts and complex topics across all areas of knowledge. The audience leaned forward in their seats. Even the camera operators and production staff, who had seen dozens of episodes filmed, seemed more engaged than usual. Something special was happening. Thomas, in quantum mechanics, what is the name of the phenomenon where particles remain connected regardless of distance? Victoria asked. Thomas hesitated. He had read about quantum physics years ago, but had never studied it deeply. Quantum entanglement, he finally answered. Relief washing over him as Victoria confirmed it was correct. James? Which female mathematicians work on abstract algebra became fundamental to modern computer science. James closed his eyes briefly, searching his memory. He had read about several female mathematicians who were often overlooked by history. Emmy Noether, he said, and Victoria smiled. Correct. Questions continued, each one more challenging than the last. They covered topics so diverse and specific that answering correctly required not just knowledge, but the ability to make connections between different fields. A question about ancient philosophy required understanding its influence on modern political theory. A question about chemical elements needed knowledge of their practical applications in technology. A question about classical literature demanded awareness of its historical context. Thomas drew on his years of academic reading, his scholarly approach to learning. He had spent decades in an environment where knowledge was systematized, categorized, and built upon established foundations. His answers came from a place of structured understanding, the kind that formal education cultivates. He answered 8 questions correctly and missed 2. Both related to contemporary science and technology. James approached each question differently. His knowledge had been acquired through curiosity rather than curriculum, through passion rather than requirement. He had no systematic framework, but instead had built a web of connections in his mind where everything he learned linked to something else. When asked about economic theory, he connected it to historical events he had studied. When questioned about artistic movements, he related them to the philosophical ideas of the time. He answered 9 questions correctly, missing only 1 about advanced mathematics. As the final round concluded, Victoria announced the scores. Thomas Whitmore, 32 points. James Mitchell, 33 points. The audience erupted in applause and gasps of surprise. The Royal Guard had defeated the history teacher. Against all expectations, the man with no university degree had outperformed the Oxford doctorate holder. Thomas stood motionless for a moment. Processing what had happened, he had lost. Not by much, but he had lost nonetheless. His first instinct was embarrassment, but as he looked across at James, who appeared equally stunned by his own victory, Thomas felt something unexpected: respect. This young man had not won through luck or chance. He had won through genuine knowledge and intellectual ability. Victoria approached James for the winner's interview, a tradition on the show. "James, how do you feel right now?" she asked, holding the microphone toward him. James struggled to find words. "Honestly, I am shocked. Thomas is incredibly knowledgeable, and I have so much respect for his expertise. I think this just shows that learning can happen anywhere, in any way. You do not need a university to educate yourself if you have curiosity and dedication." The audience applauded again, moved by his humility and sincerity. Victoria then turned to Thomas. "Thomas, that was an incredibly close match. What are your thoughts?" Thomas took a deep breath, and in that moment made a choice that would define his character. James deserves this victory completely. "I came here thinking my formal education gave me an advantage, but I have learned something important tonight. Knowledge is not about credentials or degrees. It is about genuine curiosity and the willingness to keep learning. James embodies that spirit better than I have in years. Congratulations. The two men shook hands again, but this time it was different. There was genuine warmth, mutual respect between them. The audience responded with a standing ovation, moved by the grace both men had shown. What could have been a moment of humiliation for Thomas had become something more meaningful, a recognition that learning and knowledge transcend the boundaries of formal education. After the cameras stopped rolling and the audience departed, James and Thomas found themselves in the green room together. The initial awkwardness dissolved quickly as they began talking. Thomas asked James about his approach to learning, genuinely curious about how someone without formal guidance had achieved such breadth of knowledge. James explained his routine. The hours spent reading after work, the documentaries watched late into the night, the constant questioning and seeking of information. I never had the money or opportunity for university, he admitted. But I realized that did not have to stop me from learning. Libraries are free. The internet contains more information than any single person could learn in a lifetime. The only thing I needed was discipline and genuine interest. Thomas listened, recognizing something he had lost over the years. When he had started teaching, every historical discovery had excited him. Every new book had felt like an adventure. Somewhere along the way, learning had become a job rather than a passion. He had allowed himself to become comfortable, to stop pushing beyond his established expertise. Thomas said thoughtfully, I have been teaching for almost 30 years, and I thought I understood what it meant to love learning. But watching you tonight, I realized I had confused expertise in one area with genuine intellectual curiosity across all areas. You reminded me why I became a history teacher in the first place. They exchanged contact information before leaving the studio. James returned home to find dozens of messages from friends, family, and fellow guards who had watched the episode. Sarah had already called 5 times, crying with joy and pride. His commanding officer sent a formal message congratulating him on representing the guards with distinction. Even tourists who had photographed him in his uniform sent messages through social media, amazed to discover the thinking man behind the stoic exterior. Thomas drove home in thoughtful silence. His wife greeted him with a hug, having watched the episode live. You were wonderful, she said. Both of you were. Thomas smiled, but it was tinged with reflection. I lost, he said simply. His wife shook her head. You showed grace and humility. That is a different kind of winning. Over the following days, the episode gained unexpected attention. Clips circulated on social media. Educational blogs wrote articles about the importance of self-directed learning. News outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the contrast between the two contestants and the surprising outcome. James found himself recognized on the streets. Something deeply uncomfortable for someone who had spent years trying to be invisible in plain sight. The attention brought opportunities James had never imagined. A publisher contacted him about writing a book on self-education. A university invited him to speak to students about alternative paths to knowledge. Educational charities reached out, wanting him to advocate for accessible learning resources. Each opportunity felt surreal, almost overwhelming. Thomas experienced his own transformation. The episode had forced him to confront his own complacency. Rather than retreating into defensiveness, he chose to embrace the lesson. He began exploring subjects outside his comfort zone, reading about science, technology, and contemporary issues with fresh curiosity. His students noticed the change, commenting that Mr. Whitmore seemed more engaged and enthusiastic than they had ever seen him. 3 weeks after the episode aired, Thomas sent James a message suggesting they meet for coffee. James agreed, curious about what the history teacher wanted to discuss. They met at a quiet cafe in London, and after the initial pleasantries, Thomas laid out an idea he had been developing. I have been thinking a lot since our competition, Thomas began. About education, about learning, about how we share knowledge with others. I teach in a school where education is a privilege that costs tens of thousands of pounds per year. You learned entirely on your own, for free, through dedication and curiosity. There is something wrong with a system where those two realities exist so far apart. James listened intently as Thomas continued. I want to start something. Not another school, but a different kind of educational resource. A program that connects people like you, who have educated themselves, with young people who might not have access to traditional education, mentorship, guidance, proof that learning does not require expensive institutions. Would you be interested in working with me on this? Ames sat back in his chair, processing Thomas's proposal. The idea was ambitious, perhaps even audacious, yet it resonated deeply with his own experiences and beliefs. He thought about his younger self, the boy in a small Yorkshire village who had wanted to learn but had no clear path forward. If such a program had existed then, how different might his journey have been? I am interested, James said carefully, but I am not an educator. I do not have teaching credentials or experience working with young people. What could I actually offer? Thomas smiled at the question, recognizing the same self-doubt that had almost prevented James from auditioning for the show in the first place. You offer something more valuable than credentials, Thomas replied. You offer proof that it is possible. Every young person who thinks they cannot succeed because they lack money or connections needs to see someone like you, someone who found a way despite obstacles. That is not something I can teach because I've never lived it, but you have. Over the next several weeks, James and Thomas met regularly to develop their vision. They decided to call the initiative Pathways to Knowledge. The concept was straightforward, but powerful. Create a free online platform where self-educated individuals could share their learning journeys, resources, and strategies with young people seeking alternative educational paths. The platform would offer mentorship opportunities, study guides compiled from free resources. In a community where learners could support each other, Thomas reached out to his network of educators, many of whom were initially skeptical. The academic establishment often viewed self-education with suspicion, seeing it as inferior to formal instruction. However, Thomas's reputation and his passionate advocacy gradually won people over. Several university professors agreed to contribute by curating lists of freely available resources in their fields. Librarians offered to help identify the best materials. Even some of his fellow teachers, inspired by Thomas's renewed enthusiasm, volunteered their time. James focused on documenting his own learning process. He created detailed accounts of how he had approached different subjects, what resources he had found most valuable, and what strategies had helped him retain information. Writing these guides forced him to articulate methods he had developed instinctively over years. He discovered that he had, in fact, created a sophisticated self-education system without consciously realizing it. The project faced challenges from the start. Funding was limited to what Thomas and James could contribute from their own savings, plus small donations from supporters. Building a functional website required technical expertise neither possessed, forcing them to learn web development or recruit volunteers with those skills. Most challenging was convincing young people that self-education was a viable option when society constantly reinforced the message that formal credentials were essential. Sarah became one of the project's earliest and most dedicated volunteers. As a social worker, she regularly encountered young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who had fallen through educational cracks. She knew firsthand how many talented, curious minds were wasted because circumstances prevented them from accessing traditional education. She helped James and Thomas understand the practical barriers these young people faced: lack of computer access, unstable home environments, mental health challenges, and the overwhelming pressure of poverty. Their first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a technology company's CEO who had watched James's television appearance reached out offering to provide free website hosting and technical support. The CEO himself, a college dropout who had built his fortune through self-education, believed passionately in the initiative's mission. His company's involvement brought credibility and resources that transformed Pathways to Knowledge from an ambitious idea into a functional platform. The website launched 6 months after James and Thomas's coffee shop conversation. The design was simple and accessible, focusing on content rather than flashy features. The homepage featured James's story alongside stories from other self-educated individuals. a former homeless woman who had taught herself programming and now worked as a software developer, a refugee who had learned English and then multiple other languages entirely through free online resources, a young man with severe dyslexia who had found alternative ways to absorb information through audiobooks and podcasts. The resources section was carefully organized by subject, with each area including a curated list of free materials ranked by quality and accessibility. Thomas had insisted on rigorous standards, refusing to include resources that were overly complicated or required significant background knowledge. Everything had to be genuinely accessible to someone starting with minimal preparation. The mentorship program matched experienced self-learners with young people seeking guidance. James took on 3 mentees in the first month: a 16-year-old girl who had dropped out of school due to bullying but loved biology, an 18-year-old from a low-income family who worked full-time but dreamed of understanding philosophy, and a 20-year-old with a disability that made traditional classroom attendance difficult, but who possessed a remarkable talent for mathematics. Working with these young people transformed James in ways he had not anticipated. His own learning had always been solitary and internal. Now he had to articulate his methods, explain his thinking, and adapt his approach to suit different personalities and circumstances. The girl, interested in biology, struggled with reading comprehension, so James guided her toward video lectures and interactive simulations. The philosophy enthusiast worked night shifts, so James helped him find audiobooks and podcasts he could listen to during commutes. The mathematics student needed visual representations, so James discovered software that could illustrate complex concepts graphically. Each mentoring session taught James something new about the diversity of human learning. He had assumed his own path could be replicated by others, but he quickly realized that everyone's journey was unique. Some people learned best through reading, others through listening, still others through doing. Some needed structure and schedules, while others thrived with flexibility. His role was not to impose his methods, but to help each person discover their own optimal approach. Thomas experienced similar revelations. His decades of teaching had given him expertise in delivering information to groups, but mentoring individuals one-on-one required different skills. He worked with mentees studying history, literature, and social sciences. One young man he mentored had been in the foster care system and had missed significant portions of formal schooling. Thomas found himself not just teaching history, but helping this young man build fundamental study skills and confidence that traditional education assumed students already possessed. The platform grew steadily. Within 3 months, it had 500 registered users. Within 6 months, that number had doubled. Media coverage helped spread awareness, but the real growth came from word of mouth. Young people told friends about the resources they had discovered. Parents shared the site with children struggling in traditional schools. Social workers and youth organizations began recommending pathways to knowledge. To the young people they served, success stories began emerging. The girl James mentored in biology passed her equivalency exams and was accepted into a nursing program at a community college. She credited James's guidance and the platform's resources with giving her a second chance at education. The philosophy enthusiast started a podcast discussing philosophical concepts in accessible language, building a small but dedicated following. These victories, modest as they might seem compared to traditional academic achievements, represented profound transformations in individual lives. However, success brought new challenges. The platform's popularity strained the volunteer-based model. Thomas and James found themselves working late into the night responding to requests for help, reviewing new resources, and managing the growing community. Both men still had their regular jobs. Thomas continued teaching, though he had reduced his course load. James remained a royal guard, though his commanding officer had grown increasingly flexible about his schedule given the positive attention the initiative brought. 8 months after the launch, they faced a crucial decision. A nonprofit foundation that supported educational innovation offered them a grant of £50,000 to expand pathways to knowledge. The funding would allow them to hire part-time staff, improve the website's functionality, and develop more comprehensive resources. However, accepting the grant required formally registering as a charity, creating a governance structure, and meeting various regulatory requirements. It meant transforming their passionate project into an actual organization with all the responsibilities that entailed. James and Thomas met to discuss the decision at the same cafe where they had first planned the initiative. Both felt overwhelmed by how quickly things had developed. What had started as a simple idea to help a few young people had grown into something much larger, something that was beginning to demand more than they could give while maintaining their other commitments. "I never imagined it would grow this fast," James admitted. "Sometimes I feel completely out of my depth. I am a soldier, not a charity director." Thomas nodded in understanding. "I feel the same. I am a teacher, comfortable in my classroom. This requires skills neither of us really possesses. Fundraising, management, strategic planning. Maybe we should find someone else to take this forward. Someone with experience running organizations." They sat in silence for a moment, both grappling with the same question. Were they the right people to lead? What pathways to knowledge was becoming? Then Thomas remembered something. "Do you know what struck me most about our competition on that television show?" he asked. James shook his head. "It was not the questions we answered correctly. It was how we both handled the experience despite it being completely outside our comfort zones. You had never been on television, never competed publicly. I had never faced that kind of intellectual challenge outside academia. We both could have withdrawn, claimed it was not for us. But we did not. We pushed through the discomfort." James considered this, seeing where Thomas was heading. "You're saying we should do the same now? Except that we do not know everything about running a charity, but learn as we go." Thomas smiled. "Exactly. We started this because we believe in the value of self-education, of learning independently when formal systems are unavailable or inadequate. How can we advocate for that principle if we are unwilling to apply it to ourselves? We can learn how to run an organization the same way we learned everything else." The decision made. They accepted the grant and registered Pathways to Knowledge as a formal charity. The process was bureaucratic and tedious, involving paperwork, legal consultations, and countless forms. Both men found themselves learning about topics they had never expected to encounter: charity law, financial management, organizational governance. It was humbling and occasionally frustrating, but also strangely exciting. They were students again, beginners in a new field. They hired 2 part-time staff members, a young woman with experience in nonprofit communications and a retired teacher, who had volunteered with the platform since its early days. This small team brought much-needed expertise while preserving the initiative's grassroots spirit. The improved website attracted more users, and the additional resources helped mentors work more effectively with their mentees. 1 year after their television appearance, James and Thomas were invited to speak at an education conference in Manchester. The invitation felt surreal to both of them. They would be presenting alongside university professors, educational researchers, and policy experts. The conference theme was Alternative Pathways in Education, and the organizers wanted to feature Pathways to Knowledge as a practical example of innovative approaches too. Learning the conference took place in a modern convention center filled with hundreds of educators, researchers, and policymakers. James felt the familiar nervousness he had experienced before the television show, but this time it was tempered by experience. He had learned that he could step outside his comfort zone and survive, even thrive. Still, presenting to an audience of education professionals felt daunting. These were people who had spent careers studying how people learn. What could a royal guard possibly tell them? Thomas experienced different anxieties. He was comfortable with public speaking and familiar with academic conferences, but this time he was not presenting established research or historical analysis. He was presenting something more personal, a story of his own transformation and a model that challenged conventional educational assumptions. He worried about how his academic peers would receive it. Would they see Pathways to Knowledge as a valuable innovation, or as naive idealism that ignored the complexities of education? Their presentation was scheduled for the afternoon of the second day. They spent the morning attending other sessions, listening to researchers discuss learning theories, technological innovations in education, and barriers to educational access. Many presentations were filled with jargon and abstract concepts. James struggled to follow some of them, feeling again the gap between his self-education and formal academic training. Thomas, however, found himself increasingly frustrated by how disconnected much of the research seemed from the actual experience of learning and teaching. When their turn came, they walked onto the stage together, facing an audience of approximately 300 people. Thomas began providing context for their story. He described his own career, his comfortable expertise, and his growing restlessness. He explained how the television show had forced him to confront his assumptions about knowledge and education. He spoke honestly about losing to James and what that loss had taught him. Then James took over, telling his story in his own words. He described growing up without resources, finding refuge in the local library, teaching himself across countless subjects. He explained his motivation for auditioning for the show and his shock at winning. He talked about what he had learned from working with mentees through pathways to knowledge, that motivation and curiosity could overcome tremendous obstacles, but that most people needed some guidance and community support to sustain self-directed learning. Together, they presented data on the platform's growth and impact. Over 1,000 users had registered. More than 50 mentoring relationships were active. Dozens of young people had achieved goals they had thought impossible, passing exams, gaining employment, starting creative projects, or simply rediscovering the joy of learning. The numbers were modest compared to traditional educational institutions, serving thousands or millions. But each number represented a real person whose life had been genuinely changed. They concluded with a challenge to the audience. "We believe formal education has tremendous value," Thomas said, "but we also believe it cannot be the only path. Too many people are left behind by traditional systems. Too many curious minds are told they cannot learn because they lack the right credentials or circumstances. We need to recognize and support the many ways people can educate themselves." Ames added his perspective. "I am proof that self-education can work. But I also know I was fortunate in ways many others are not. I had access to libraries, the internet, time to read, and a stable enough life that I could dedicate energy to learning. Many young people face obstacles I never did. Our goal is not to replace formal education, but to ensure that everyone, regardless of circumstances, has a pathway to knowledge." The audience's response surprised them both. The applause was enthusiastic and sustained. During the question period that followed, hands shot up throughout the auditorium. Questions came from teachers interested in incorporating self-directed learning into their classrooms, from researchers wanting to study the platform's effectiveness, from policymakers curious about how such initiatives could be scaled or supported through public funding. One question came from a woman in the back row who identified herself as a university professor. "I appreciate what you have built," she said, her tone measured, "but I worry about the quality control. Without formal assessment and credentialing, how do we ensure that people are actually learning accurately? How do we prevent the spread of misinformation?" It was a fair question, and one James and Thomas had grappled with themselves. Thomas responded first. "You raise important concerns. We have tried to address them by carefully curating resources, prioritizing materials from reputable sources, and encouraging mentors to help mentees develop critical thinking skills. But you are right that self-education requires more individual responsibility for verifying information. We see that not as a weakness, but as a crucial skill everyone needs to develop." James added, "In my experience, self-learners often become more critical readers because they have to evaluate sources themselves. They cannot simply trust that everything presented in a classroom has been vetted. That skepticism and questioning can be valuable." The professor nodded thoughtfully, not entirely convinced but willing to consider the perspective. After the presentation, dozens of people approached them, wanting to continue the conversation. Teachers shared stories of students who did not fit traditional educational models and asked for advice. Young people in the audience, often graduate students, talked about their own struggles with formal education and expressed interest in volunteering with pathways to knowledge. Several potential donors expressed interest in supporting the initiative's expansion. Among those who approached was an older gentleman with kind eyes and a warm smile. He introduced himself as Dr. Robert Pearson, retired education professor who had spent decades researching alternative learning models. "I have been studying self-education and informal learning for 40 years, he said. "What you have created is exactly what I have always believed was possible, but rarely saw implemented effectively. Would you be willing to collaborate on some research? I think documenting your model and its outcomes could be valuable for the broader education community." The offer was unexpected but exciting. Academic research could provide credibility and evidence for what they were doing. It's potentially attracting more support and resources. They agreed to meet with Dr. Pearson to discuss possibilities. Over the following months, he became an invaluable advisor, helping them think more systematically about their approach while respecting the grassroots. Human-centered spirit that made pathways to knowledge. Effective, the conference marked a turning point for both James and Thomas personally. For James, it represented full acceptance into a world he had never imagined entering. He was no longer just a curious guard reading books in his spare time. He was a recognized advocate for alternative education, someone whose story and experience had value and influence. The imposter syndrome that had plagued him began to fade, replaced by confident humility. He knew what he had achieved, but he also knew he was still learning, still growing. For Thomas, the conference confirmed that his own transformation was complete. He had begun his journey feeling restless and unfulfilled despite his impressive credentials. Now, he felt genuinely engaged with his work again, but in a completely different way. He was no longer primarily an expert dispensing knowledge to students. He was a facilitator, a connector, someone helping others find their own paths to learning. It was messier and less prestigious than his previous role, but infinitely more satisfying. 2 years after their television appearance, James made a difficult decision. He resigned from his position as a royal guard to work full-time with Pathways to Knowledge. The decision was not made lightly. He loved the discipline and tradition of his guard duties, and leaving meant giving up stability and a clear career path. However, the initiative had grown to the point where it needed dedicated leadership, and James felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. His final day at the palace was emotional. His fellow guards organized a small ceremony, presenting him with a commemorative plaque, thanking him for his service. His commanding officer spoke about how James had shown that guards were not mere symbols but thinking individuals with diverse talents and contributions. Several tourists who had followed James's story since the television show made special trips to photograph him one last time in uniform. Thomas also made changes, though less dramatic than James's. He continued teaching but reduced his course load to part-time, dedicating the rest of his energy to Pathways to Knowledge. His school was supportive, proud to have a teacher involved in such an innovative project. Thomas found that his part-time teaching actually improved his classroom work. He brought fresh energy and ideas from his work with the initiative, and his students benefited from his renewed enthusiasm. Pathways to Knowledge continued to grow and evolve. By its 3rd year, the platform had over 5,000 registered users across the United Kingdom and had begun attracting international attention. Educators in other countries reached out, wanting to adapt the model for their own contexts. The organization received additional grants and even some corporate sponsorship, allowing them to hire more staff and develop new resources. The success stories multiplied. A young man who had been homeless used the platform's resources to teach himself web design and now ran his own small business. A mother of 3 who had never finished secondary school used the mentoring program to prepare for her equivalency exams and was admitted to university as a mature student. A teenager with severe social anxiety found community through the platform's online forums and gained confidence to pursue learning goals she had previously thought impossible. James and Thomas were invited to more conferences, appeared on podcasts and radio programs, and were featured in articles about educational innovation. They received an award from an education charity recognizing their contribution to increasing access to learning. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most to both of them were the individual messages they received from young people, whose lives had been changed by discovering that learning was possible for them, regardless of their circumstances. On the 3rd anniversary of their television appearance, the production company that had created Battle of Minds invited James and Thomas back for a special reunion episode. They would not compete against each other again, but would instead be interviewed about what had happened since their memorable match. The show's producers had followed their story with interest, pleased that their program had sparked something meaningful. During the taping, Victoria Reynolds asked them what they considered their greatest achievement over the past 3 years. Thomas answered first. Rediscovering what I loved about education in the first place. I spent decades as a teacher, but somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that teaching is not about credentials or institutions. It is about helping people discover their own capacity to learn and think. James reminded me of that, and I am grateful. James's answer was simpler, but equally heartfelt. I learned that my own voice matters. For most of my life, I thought people like me, without fancy degrees or important jobs, should stay quiet and let the experts speak. But everyone has knowledge and experience that can help others. Sharing what I have learned in my own way has been the most meaningful thing I have ever done. The episode ended with Victoria asking where they saw pathways to knowledge in 5 years. James and Thomas exchanged glances, both smiling. They had learned to be ambitious, but realistic, to dream big while staying grounded in practical reality. We hope to reach 10,000 learners, Thomas said. We want to expand our mentoring program, develop more comprehensive resources, and help even more people discover their own pathways to knowledge. But more than numbers, James added, we hope to change the conversation about education. We want people to understand that learning does not stop when formal schooling ends, and it does not start only when formal schooling begins. Everyone is capable of educating themselves if given the right support and encouragement. That message, more than anything, is what we hope spreads. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio audience applauded, James and Thomas stood together, no longer competitors but true partners. Their journey had begun with a competition on a television show, a contest that could have ended with handshakes and forgotten within days. Instead, it had sparked a friendship, a collaboration, and an initiative that was genuinely improving lives. The audience that had once been speechless, watching a royal guard defeat a history teacher in knowledge, had witnessed something more significant than they initially realized. They had seen two people from different worlds discover common ground in their shared belief that knowledge belongs to everyone, that learning has no boundaries, and that the pursuit of understanding is one of the most human endeavors possible. That message, carried forward through pathways to knowledge and through every life it touched, would continue to echo far beyond that initial moment of surprise and applause.